Hello friends and welcome back to my channel No Book Left Behind. I'm your host Mark and today it's my monthly reading roundup for April. Hello, and if you're new to the channel, welcome. But if you're a returning viewer, you'll know that my monthly reading roundups are all about my Read What You Own challenge. And this challenge began on the 1st of January when I realised that, well, no, not some realisation so much. I got fed up with tripping over the piles of books which are sitting on the floor behind me down there, which you can't actually see. Because that bookcase over there is my TBR bookcase. And it was full. And as I say, there were piles of books on the floor. And counting up, I think it was 243 books in total. Correct me if I'm wrong, that was a few months ago. I think it was 243, I think. But yeah, I needed to do something about it. So I put myself on a book buying ban and decided I would read 100 books before I bought another one. With the caveat that if I found something I've been looking for an awfully long time, or something that was suddenly hugely affordable when it hadn't been before, I was allowed to buy it. But I would have to add 5 books to that 100 total. So currently that Read What You Own challenge is actually 105 books because that has happened once. Now, my aim for this really every month was to read 10 books because I didn't really want to be on this challenge forever, and I thought it would be quite tough doing 10 months at it. Well, it's quite tough doing a couple of months at it really, let's face it. I mean, we're all addicted to buying books, aren't we? That's why we're here. At least that's why I'm here. But yes, I had to try and read 10 books a month, and for the first couple of months that went fine. Okay, March I was 9 books. It was still acceptable, but I struggled in the first half of April, and you'll know that if you watched my mid-month reading roundup video where I covered the 4 books I managed to read, which were Audrey, Her Real Story, biography by Alexander Walker, which was okay. Dark City, The Lost Worlds of Film Noir by Eddie Muller, which wasn't just okay, it was absolutely brilliant, and I spent far too much time reading it as a result because I didn't want it to finish. I thoroughly recommend this. After that, I thought I'd tackle, because most of the first half of April had gone by then because I'd taken far too long over those 2 books, and so I thought I would take the 2 shortest books on my TBR for April and read them next, because that would enable me to get back on track, right? But it didn't, because the first of those was The Unholy City by Charles G. Finney, which was an awful slog. I pretty much detested it. so that took longer than it should have done. And the same could be said for Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland, which was a lost world literature about a feminist utopia. This is not bad, but it's not something that I could breeze through quickly. So I only managed 4 books in the first half of the month. So I had a bit of a dilemma here because I'd been way too ambitious with that April TBR. Way too ambitious. There were far too many doorstep books in it. I had no way I was going to make 10 for the month after that start. Especially considering that the Audrey Hepburn book was a holdover from the previous month, and the Eddie Muller Dark City book wasn't on the April TBR because I'd left it off by mistake and nominated another 10 books instead of that. So yeah, I was never going to get through the whole 10. So for the second half of the month, I thought, well, if nothing else, I'm going to read the book I really, really want to read this month, the one that I'm really determined to read and should have got around to ages ago, irrespective of the length of it. So that one was this little baby, which is The Boats of the Glen, Carrig and Other Nautical Adventures by William Hope Hodgson. Now, you can obviously see this is a very smart hardback edition. There are 5 of these. They were published by Nightshade Books several years ago now. I have the whole set. It cost me a lot of money to get the whole set, and my version of a lot of money probably isn't what most people's is. It's considerably lower because I'm not exactly got a huge amount of financial resources behind me. But yeah, I spent considerable money on these 5 books for me, especially book number 4, which actually, well, let's be honest, it did cost me a couple of £100, which is terrible. And I still feel guilty, strangely, about buying that, even though it was the one I'd been looking for about a decade to complete the set, and it's my money, so I can do what I want with it. I still feel a bit sort of guilty about it, really. I guess that comes from a sort of being well, not an impoverished background, that's unfair, but I certainly went through a period of my life where I was fairly heavily in debt, so mostly due to my bar bills, I'm afraid. So yeah, I do feel guilty about buying the whole set, really, but I've never read them. That's the crazy thing. That's the point of mentioning that, because it's insane that I'd never actually read them. They've just been sitting on a bookshelf, probably as a full set, for about 4 years. So I was determined that I was going to get round to these this year, at least read the first volume, which I have done. So I've got that done. So what's it all about then? Okay. The Boats of the Glen Carrig is a novel. The other nautical adventures are a bunch of short stories that Hodgson wrote. Now, I've read a lot of Hodgson over the years. I've read The Boats of the Glen Carrig several times, for example. And I don't tend to look in books at the contents before I pick them up to read them. I kind of keep that for a nice surprise. Not always, but most of the time. So when I picked this up, I fully expected it just to be a list of stories that I knew as well as that novel. And it wasn't. Most of it, nearly all of it, in fact, apart from the novel, I wasn't familiar with at all. And that's because most of the rest of it is not weird fiction. It's nautical adventures, as it says in the title of the volume. So I'd simply not read them, and they were new to me. But we'll get into those in a minute, because first we've got to talk about the Boats of the Glen Carrig. Now, this is a story of some sailors who end up in two sort of, well, to call them lifeboats gives you a kind of idea that these are traditionally small kind of craft, but from the actual novel you get the impression these are far more substantial vessels. But they end up in these boats after their ship founders when it hits an unseen rock in the middle of the ocean. And they are cast adrift and spend several days just struggling to survive before a storm separates the two boats. And we follow one of them, which is captained by the boatswain, who is the senior officer who remains from the crew, and also features our narrator, the ship's passenger named John Winterstraw. Supplies start to run low, and they begin encountering these patches of floating weed on the ocean surface, so thick and clinging that after a time it becomes quite difficult to navigate their way through them. In fact, they see some old ships that have been trapped there, presumably for as long as 100 years, and are now almost completely overgrown and partially submerged. Eventually they come to an island which also has some strange vegetation, but by then they've already encountered some of the denizens of the ocean in the area, strange monsters and peculiar aggressive weed creatures. Now, this is great stuff. I've read it several times over the years and enjoyed it thoroughly every time. I think it's one of Hodgson's best works. It's such a unique setup, this eerie weedscape, if you like, where these sailors are trapped. It's just a fantastic idea for a story, and it's told in such a grounded, matter-of-fact way that the more outlandish aspects seem perfectly credible. There's a lot of nautical terms included as well, which I must confess went straight over my head, but they do help ground it. They do help give it a flavour of these bygone sailing times when guys would just basically sail off the edge of the map right into the unknown with no idea of what they might be facing. I just think this is a wonderful novel and such a great way to start this volume. Now, the next section of the book is entitled The Sargasso Sea Stories. So you've basically got half a dozen tales set in the same universe, on the same weed continent, if you like. Now, these could be viewed as dry runs for the novel, possibly proof of concept maybe. On the other hand, publication dates are around the same time as the Boats of the Glen Carrig, so it's hard to be certain about that. But then there does seem to be some lack of information about the exact writing chronology of Hodgson's career. For example, his final novel, or the final published one, the classic The Nightland, came out in 1912. but some commentators believe this is actually the first novel that he ever wrote. So we can't really be sure about these Sargasso Sea stories in that respect, but they're still highly enjoyable, although not at the level of the boats of the Glen Carrig. Next up are the exploits of Captain Galt. Now these are 13 tales about a smuggler. Now this guy is not a pirate. He doesn't employ any violent methods. There are no action scenes where he's running down the beach away from the forces of law and order, firing muskets back at them or anything of that nature. No, Captain Galt put me in mind very much of Raffles, the amateur cracksman. In other words, he's a gentleman smuggler. And these are stories about the various dodges and tricks he employs to outfox the customs agents at various ports. And these are thoroughly entertaining. I really did enjoy these, and I can see why it became a series. What remains are 4 more stories, and 2 attempts by Hodgson to create recurring characters, Captain Jat and DCO Kugunka. Now, Captain Jat is a much dodgier adventurer than Captain Galt. He sails the 7 seas looking for treasure, and you could describe him as a pirate, I would guess. Certainly the first of these 2 stories, The Island of the Ood, definitely comes under the weird fiction category, and I thoroughly enjoyed that one. I really did. Jat never took off, probably because he's simply too much of an anti-hero for the readers of the time. He's casually violent to such an extent that really you don't like him very much, even though the point of the stories is he's generally outfoxed by his cabin boy Pibby, who ends up with the spoils of war, shall we say. But yeah, those 2 stories are pretty entertaining, especially The Island of the Ood. That's well worth a read. The other recurring character, DCO Kugunka, is again an adventurer. These are not so remarkable for me, these stories, although I did enjoy The Bells of the Laughing Sally, because that definitely has a very macabre element to it, which I did particularly enjoy. I guess that says a bit about my taste, where the more conventional adventures that these 2 guys go on, I think are the 2 weaker stories in both cases. But overall, this is simply a great volume, and The Boats of the Glen Carrig, I think, is a wonderful novel, and I think it's essential for lovers of weird fiction. So I'd recommend this thoroughly. Now, sticking with weird fiction, which, as you probably know, is my thing, my next selection was Tales of the Tattooed, an anthology of ink, edited by John Miller, which was the 13th book published in the British Library's Tales of the Weird series. Now, if you're a regular viewer on the channel, what you'll know is that I'm going through this series book by book, and every 3 books I stop and make an individual video where I review the 3 I've just read. So I'm not going to go into this one in too much detail here, just touch on it briefly. And what I would say about it is that this is a very consistent anthology. What I particularly enjoyed, strangely enough, was the introduction that Miller wrote, because he talks about the history of tattooing, and I confess myself to be in complete ignorance of the subject, and I found actually I think it's only about 8 pages, but I found it actually quite fascinating, particularly this apparently mad craze that Victorians had for getting themselves tattooed. And I'm not talking about sailors or shall we say the lower orders. I'm talking about socialites in particular. They like nothing more than getting a tattoo, which just seems very strange to me now. You don't tend to associate that kind of thing with the upper crust of Victorian times. Moving on to the stories. Now, pleasingly, for a start, I had not read any of them before. None of them were familiar to me, and 10 out of the 13 authors were also names I did not know. And that's what I come to the Tales of the Weird for, to discover new writers. Also, there are no make-weight stories here. I think it's fair to say that some of the earlier volumes in the series do have some selections which feel like they're there to make up the numbers from time to time. It's only a couple of stories here and there in each volume. And there's nothing like that here, because this is a very consistent anthology indeed. Everything is of a certain standard. Unfortunately, that also means that there's nothing outstanding. There was nothing that really grabbed me and really made me want to check that writer out further. My favourite was the tattooed card, and I'd say was possibly the exception. to that previous statement, because this tale by William E. Barrett features a well-to-do rich young man who disguises himself as Needle Mike, a tattoo artist, and keeps a shop in a seamy part of the city. And he does this just for the thrill of it, really, just to have a change from his kind of mundane sort of everyday life. But of course, inevitably associating with some of these less desirable elements of society, he gets involved in crime. And it's worth mentioning at this point here as well, which I probably should have mentioned already, there's not any supernatural stuff in this volume. Tales of the Tattooed are tales of crime and adventure. So if you're looking for something a little bit more spooky and ghostly, this isn't a volume that you should go to. But I did enjoy the Tattooed card quite a lot, and Needle Mike actually starred in a series of 16 separate stories for Barrett. So I may check those out. I think it's good enough to whet my appetite without making me desperate to dive in. Elsewhere, my other favourite story, the other standout I thought, was The Tattooed Eye, which was a tale by Arthur P. Hankins. And this featured another interesting protagonist who's a female tattoo artist called Nan Sunday. And this is a very pulpy adventure, and in fact is almost long enough to be a short novel. It's about a third of this entire volume is made up with this one tale, but it is worth it and it is enjoyable. The only downside was that, from what I can gather, Nan Sunday was not a recurring character. Hankins didn't write a series of stories about her, which I think is a bit of a shame, really. So, in closing, this one's a very consistent anthology, but it's not one for your supernatural and spooky fans. And it's a solid entry in the Tales of the Weird series. And next up was Bloodgrove by Walter Mosley. Now, this is the 15th novel in his Easy Roll-In series and was published in 2021. Very modern for me. Now, if you're a regular viewer to the channel, you'll know that there's a couple of series that I'm trying to catch up on, having fallen behind over the years, and this is one of them. And the other being the Lincoln Rhyme series written by Jeffrey Deaver, and basically I read one or other each month. Now, one of the main things I really love about the Easy Roll-In series is that it chronologically follows his life. In the very first entry, Devil in a Blue Dress, which came out in 1990, I believe, Easy had just been demobbed from the army and was just doing favours around the streets of LA. But by the time of Bloodgrove, over 20 years later, set in 1969, he's running his own detective agency, the senior partner with 2 juniors. And this approach has allowed to give us Mosley's alternate black man's history of late 20th century America, and I really loved that concept. And by the time we get to this entry, Easy has achieved financial prosperity. He's been through many different jobs, including working as a school janitor, but some shrewd real estate investments and some increasingly high-profile detective cases have brought him into the money. But of course, he's a black man in white man's America, so trouble is just around the corner. And this time that comes in the form of Vietnam vet Craig Killian, who is suffering from a severe case of PTSD and wants Easy to investigate whether he has killed someone in an altercation in a remote area outside of the city called Bloodgrove. And unsurprisingly, this leads to the usual twisted, labyrinthine path of gunplay, violence, corpses, and the fallout from an armoured car robbery. Now, I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. Mosley took a 6-year break from the character at one stage, and ever since he's come back even stronger. Because some of those early entries in the series, although I always loved the character, I always felt they were a little uneven at times. Bad boy Brawley Brown, for instance, being a particular disappointment, as I recall. But this new set of novels, which began with Little Green in 2013, is just excellent. Mosley's knocking it out of the park every single time. The plots are better, the writing is superb. These are just a wonderful series of books. There's a wonderful cast of returning supporting characters who help with the world building, and Mosley really nails the tension of Easy's everyday life. For example, he's come into the legitimate possession of a really expensive automobile, but he's forced to swap it out for something far more modest because he keeps getting stopped by the cops. Now, he's got plenty of contacts high up in the police department, so he's never arrested. It's never a problem. But Mosley really nails that weary resignation that Easy feels from having to go through this procedure time and time again. And as Easy himself says at one point in the novel, one day I'm just going to get killed for saying good morning. And that's a killer line in what, in my opinion, is a killer novel. And finally we come to All the Colours of Sergio Martino by Kat Ellinger. Now this is a part biography, part career appreciation of the Italian film director. And if you're looking at this book and thinking, that looks like a very small bookmark, that looks pretty thin, you didn't just include that to boost your numbers for this month, did you? Yeah, of course I did. But I thoroughly enjoyed it too. Now, I'm a big fan of 60s, 70s, even 80s Italian genre cinema when Martino did his most notable work, particularly in the field of the giallo thriller, where he contributed The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, which is a personal favourite of mine, All the Colours of the Dark, The Scorpion with Two Tails and Torso, among several others. And Ellinger obviously covers those films in quite a bit of depth, but pleasingly she also covers all the other aspects of Martino's career. His work with sexy comedies, for example, his work in the his work in the polizioteschi film genre. There you go, police procedurals. I practiced that for ages and I still failed desperately. And this is about the sixth take of this segment as well. Anyway, moving on from my shortcomings. Yes, Ellinger covers all these areas of Martino's career. Keep it together, Mark, keep it together. Of Martino's career with very concise and astute observations. And there's also quite a bit of production detail here, which I wasn't previously aware of, and I have read quite a bit about these movies before. Also, Ellinger exhibits quite a sly wit at times, which I really appreciated. She's talking about Italian film tradition in general. She says, quote, rough and ready, get things done at any cost, so long as it wasn't actual cash, end quote, which I think is quite a neat way of summing up the way Italian filmmakers worked at this period. And if you think that sounds like I'm being negative, I'm not really, because sometimes having limitations of resources and budget causes an upsurge in creativity and imagination. And that's something that is badly lacking in Hollywood films these days, and perhaps because they have got these almost limitless resources to fall back on, because I think those can stunt creativity rather than promote it. Anyway, enough of that. I would just like to say that this is a very worthwhile addition to the bookshelf of anyone who's interested in Italian cinema of this period. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So that was my reading month for April. Only 8 books read. So that is a disappointment. I have been trying to keep to 10 books a month for my Read What You Own challenge, or I'll be on it all year, but I failed dismally, I'm afraid. So let's just take a look at those depressing numbers, shall we? So that's it for this month and today's video. Thank you for sticking with me right the way until the end. Have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Please feel free to express yourselves in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're enjoying my content, why not give me a quick like, or perhaps even subscribe to the channel? It would be very much appreciated. And before I go, please remember, keep looking through those dusty second-hand bookshops in those narrow, weird back streets of your town. Keep going to those car boot sales, those market stalls and those charity shops, because there are treasures out there that only you can find. Be seeing you. It's my monthly reading hour.